Okay, welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. My name is David Logan. I used to be the chairperson of the British Institute at Ankara, and I'm very delighted to be hosting this webinar. Before I go any further, I want to say something about the British Institute. You probably have seen that there was a website which tells you a lot about it. The Institute is staffed by an extraordinary collection of talented experts on a wide range of subjects and in different fields. And do follow us and do join the Institute if you like. It's not expensive, and there are lots of good things to add for membership. I next want to say about the speakers. As you know, we've got 4 extremely distinguished speakers this evening, or depending on what time of day you are. And I'm not going to introduce them because you will have read about them on the website. I will, however, say that they are going to speak in a particular order. Ziya Meral is going to speak first on political aspects of the crisis which we confront. Then Mina Toksöz on the economy, John Roberts on energy particularly, and Sinan Ülgen finally on the political situation again. I mean, of course, I'm quite sure that they will all spread widely, cover many things, but that is the broad outline of what they will do. I need to say that this session is being recorded and you can see it on YouTube if you want to do it that way, either now or later. And I'm not going to say very much now myself, except to name, I think, 1 or 2 of the fairly obvious points, which I'm sure our experts will be addressing. I mean, Turkey's relationship with Ukraine and Russia is absolutely unique. Whether that's a blessing or a curse, we'll learn as the evening goes on. As you know, the 2 sides met under President Erdogan's chairmanship in Istanbul. But do we know whether Turkey will mediate? Can they mediate? I don't know. Clearly, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia is pretty desperate for Turkey in terms of its economy and in terms of energy and politics. Is there any good way out of this for Turkey? I'm not sure that there is. What about NATO? I mean, the crisis has thrown up the importance of NATO for the West. Turkey's relationship with NATO has been troubled. What does its posture in connection with this crisis has to say about Turkey's relationship with NATO, and particularly with the United States? And I think finally, the last one, I'm sure our experts will have more to say, but finally, I'd like to mention, of course, the Montreux Convention, in respect of which Turkey has a very special position. How will that be affected if we see the Black Sea becoming an area of confrontation between NATO and Russia, for example? So that's just to start us off a bit. But Ziya now will speak, and when all of our speakers have spoken, we will then have time for question and answers. And I want to say now that Sinan has got to leave rather promptly. And so at the end, when we've had the introductory remarks, if people have particular questions for Sinan, do ask them early on. Thanks. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much, David. When I think about this current crisis or the war in Ukraine, it strikes me as one of the most complex geopolitical developments that we really observed. In other words, there is the immediate war and all the questions that emerge from it, humanitarian sense and security, defense sense and trade and etc. And then there's this larger ripple effects with so many implications. And I think Turkey sits at a very close point in the periphery of this shock. It's a high probability, high impact event. We knew something was brewing, something was on the cards, but the scale of it and how it developed, probably nobody in Ankara saw it coming. But if you think about that, the war itself has a lot of direct effects to Turkey, whether it is in impact on trade ties with Russia or regionally, questions again around the supply chains from Ukraine. There's a stability and security question in Black Sea, the precariousness of that, which has been building on, particularly since 2014, as a regional challenge that Turkey has been trying to walk through, and questions of refugees, again, migration and direct implications of the war itself. But I think the biggest challenge to Turkey at this stage is the strategic challenge that it posed. For a long time, we've seen Ankara wanting to follow a policy of strategic independence, right? It's a regional power that wants to be heard, that wants its interests on the table. It wants to play a part in the conflicts in the region as a mediator, as a negotiator, but also wants to assert itself because it read the world, perhaps rather rightly, that unless Turkey developed national defense and security capabilities and posture, the traditional era of diplomacy, soft power, and those kind of alliances are not really holding tight. And Turkey had to demonstrate much more kind of resolve on these issues. And I think the Ukraine war puts that to test big time, right? What can a country like Turkey, a middle power, can do to limit the risks of a war close to its borders? And how it can seek to exploit opportunities that come with it. And if you look at how Ankara responded to it, it's been a minefield to walk into, right? So Ankara had to maintain relationships with Ukraine, which has been a very consistent bilateral relationship in terms of trade, not just in terms of the sale of Turkish drones. There's been a lot of investment there, but even with Russia, there's a lot that Turkey and Moscow, Ankara and Moscow had been working through, including the ambition for $100 billion trade volume. At the moment, it's around 30 billion, working together on questions around Syria and Libya and Black Sea and etc. There's a lot that overlaps in their interests, often contradictory, but often it's in such an interdependent way that both countries have to work together. So now Turkey has to maintain those two relationships that are at war with each other. But also, as David, you already hinted as well too, this war has raised a lot of questions about NATO, its place in today's world. In other words, its significance. All this commentary that promoted obsolescence of NATO or brain deadness of NATO turned out to be really not really plausible. It wasn't that, but clearly the need for NATO is stronger than ever. But it's going to go through a new reformation, new momentum towards further change and adaptation. Turkey's relationship with the US also comes into this picture. Now, we were all looking US's foreign policy from a perspective of tilt to Asia Pacific, that actually US was not really that interested in the European question or questions in the Middle East. What turned out, well, US has to be involved and chosen to be involved. And I think Biden administration has shown quite a good resolve on the question of Ukraine as far as they can go at this stage. And that really put another question to Turkey, because Turkey and US relations have been at a weak point. Trust has been broken between two countries. And again, Biden, even now, he really struggles acknowledging the role of Turkey as a positive kind of place in the middle of all of this. In some of the tweets and public statements, he thanks pretty much everybody except President Erdogan. But if you look at even the talks that Turkey has been hosting between Ukraine and Russia, everybody knows the limits of that, but it is really valuable diplomatically that these things are still happening, and Turkey is emerging as a country that can still sell drones to Ukraine, condemn Russian aggression, but still maintain a working relationship with Russia, and still trying to kind of buffer against the economic implications of the sanctions regime, increasing diplomatic pressure on Russia, and still trying to find a way to balance that precariousness. And Moscow is trying to do that too. They've been quite careful about how they react to how Turkey has been handling Ukraine and the drones, etc. But it also shows the opportunities that this opened up for Turkey. I mean, can Turkey use this as a new page on relations with US? There's a lot of scope there to exploit from Ankara's perspective. In relations with Europe, yes, the European Union accession and membership might be dead. It has been dead for a while, but maybe this could very well give an impetus to a new direction, a new kind of cluster of relationships, whether bilaterally or with the Union. Could this then usher us into a new era within NATO, even Europe, seeing Turkish defense developments as a positive. I think there was a lot of cynicism towards Turkish drone technology, Turkish missiles, and Turkish proactive posturing on defense issues. I think Turkey has demonstrated this actually has value for the alliance. The fact that Turkey can quickly provide drones and that have proven their worth in the field, that's actually not necessarily a challenge for the Western alliance. It's probably a really good opportunity too. And I think for Turkey, it has been a good demonstration of that, not just for NATO, but for other partners it has in Asia and towards Africa and Middle East, etc. So I think from Ankara's perspective, this is a high probability, high impact event that so far, and I'll be really keen to hear Sinan's view, Ankara has managed to walk the careful walk diplomatically. But in the long run, how long this war will last, what kind of increased pressure Russia will be subjected to, and what implications will this have for Turkey, that's yet to be seen. But I think this is one war that perhaps Ankara didn't see coming at this scale, like all of us. But I think this is one development that Ankara would have to manage regularly, very carefully from now on. You're muted, David.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ziya. That was a really good introduction. I suspect that Mina, who is going to speak next, may have a slightly different view about the opportunities which what's happening with regards to Turkey, because I think that from her point of view, there are quite a lot of downsides. Mina, can you unmute?
Hello. Yes, that's a very good introduction, David. So I'll look at some of the economic parameters of the economic Ukraine-Russia relationship and how this war is affecting them. And I must say the downsides hold out more strongly than the upsides, although there are a few upsides. Like everywhere else, the impact on the Turkish economy will be felt, first of all, through higher inflation. So there's higher energy, food price, and commodity prices. And like everywhere else, there will be tighter supply shocks and sanctions-related disruptions, therefore slower growth. In most countries, there will also be tighter monetary policy to deal with the extra inflationary consequences, but not in Turkey. And here's another difference. Although Turkey is not actively supporting the sanctions, it is passively having to follow certainly financial sanctions, as the banking sector, I think, in Turkey would be dearth to getting caught in some secondary sanctions in this way. But I'm going to argue that Turkish economy is more vulnerable than this general picture. For two reasons. One is that it was actually, I was actually surprised when I looked at the degree of economic integration with Russia and Ukraine. It's quite substantial. Secondly, Turkish economy already had weak macro fundamentals, and these two, higher inflation, lower growth that I mentioned, is just going to make that much more difficult to stabilize the situation. When we look at the economic relations, I won't go on much about energy because there's a specific session on that following. But it seems to me that Turkey is almost second to Germany in terms of its high dependence on the Russian economy. There's also, in addition to gas and oil, there's coal, and then there's the Akkuyu nuclear power plant that is being built by Rosatom. Then the grain question has been in the news quite a lot about Turkey's high dependence on grain imports from Ukraine and Russia. But actually the picture is more nuanced there. A lot of the grain that Turkey imports from Ukraine and Russia is actually exported. And it's actually not almost, but sort of 80% or so self-sufficient in, for example, wheat. So the grain, energy is a big dependence. Grain is not such a dire problem. Overall trade isn't that big, actually. It's sort of, if you add up the exports to Russia, exports to Ukraine, tourism losses, tourism revenues, and so on, and assume that Ukraine is completely closed and half of Russian exports are lost, plus half of tourism revenues are lost, it comes to about 7 to 8 billion export revenue losses, which is not insignificant for a country like Turkey with such low foreign currency reserves. Then what's really interesting is that Turkish corporates have been investing in Ukraine and Russia. And in fact, Turkey is one of the biggest FDI capital investors in Ukraine. Turkcell owns LifeCell, which is Ukraine's third biggest mobile phone company. Then lots of big corporates, from Şişecam and Eczacıbaşı in construction materials to Anadolu Efes to Otokar Karsan in automotive to Vestel in consumer electronics. All these companies have production facilities in Ukraine, in Russia. And not to mention the textile firms with hundreds of retail outlets, which are all sort of being closed in Ukraine at the moment. The bigger issue is, well, as big an issue is the Turkish contractors, which have about 30 billion of ongoing projects in Russia and Ukraine, with all the big contractors such as Doge, Enka, Renaissance, Limak busy there. And they're reporting slowdowns in supplies and how are they going to get paid and so on. So everything's kind of getting it's sort of fairly disrupted. Kozlovsky, the outgoing chairman of TÜSİAD, estimated that adding everything up, the energy price rise, the transport costs, trade disruptions, contractors, projects, disruptions, and so on, it would cost Turkey about $40 billion if the war continued at this pace. Now, is there some way of remedying some of these things? And, so there are alternative routes being found to get things to Russia and Ukraine. For Ukraine, trucks are going through Moldova. For Russia, trucks are going through Georgia, but that adds about 4 or 5 days to transport. And air is too costly. Insurance has gone through the roof. Black Sea ports not really functioning, although they've now just about started to get their act together. And then the question of how to get paid. There's been some discussion of barter trade, Turkish ruble trade for small trades. Circuitous routes are likely to be found, such as via Dubai for the Iran trade and so on. So things will sort of, adjust and continue in some way. There's some redirection of exports from Ukraine and Russia to US, for example, in textiles. North Africa is now taking more dairy. EU is taking more iron and steel exports. So there's a bit of redirection going on in terms of export performance. And the government has been trying to, and some sector representatives have been trying to come up with some upsides to the current situation, such as Turkish defense exports are up, Russian property purchases in Turkey are up. Turkey is trying to step into the supply gaps created by Western firms pulling out of the Russian market, but they're having to compete with China, India, and also even Iran. The logistics people are very optimistic that Anatolian transit route, the middle route from China, is going to become more in demand, and feel that they can make more, there's more opportunities there. And there's also the possibility that some neglected sectors in Turkey are looked at, such as agriculture, and there's absolutely no reason why Turkey has to import sunflower oil or wheat. Then maybe energy renewables will be invested in more. The Kardemir, İşdemir, the iron producers, which were operating with spare capacity, now will step into pig iron inputs into Turkish iron and Turkish steel production. Most of that was coming from Ukraine, from Azovstal, which is one of Europe's biggest pig iron factory, which was bombed just over the past month. So there's sort of some kind of maybe Turkey's self-sufficiency encouragement could be a bit of an upside. But while the real economy will struggle to adjust in some way over time, I think one of the things is that Turkey's orientation to Eurasia, this was a kind of a trade strategy that has been built up over the past 10 years, is going to be hit quite significantly with two biggest markets in the Eurasia model, Ukraine and Russia, becoming more difficult to trade with. And I mean, we all know that these sanctions are not going to be lifted anytime soon from Russia. So that's going to be a major problem for the Eurasianists and for Eurasia strategy. While that's the long-term issue, in the short term, actually, the problem is rather more acute, and that is the macro instability, which is made worse by the inflationary pressures and slower growth. Inflation was already 50% at the end of 2021. Lira was down 45%. There was this incoherent monetary policy since Albal was sacked at the central bank. And some fragile stabilization had been achieved before the Ukraine war, with some unorthodox measures brought in, such as indexing Turkish lira deposits to foreign currency to guarantee that they don't lose out. But it's pretty clear that that's fragile stabilization seen in January, February is unlikely to last. I haven't got much data since, so this is very much on sort of newspaper reports and so on. We do know that inflation rose to 60%, over 60% in March. It's going to go higher. People are sort of expecting it at least 70. Producer price inflation is already over 100%, and that's creating huge cost pressures all around the economy. So, the inflationary aspect of things are a bit out of control. On the foreign payments, that's also already looking pretty bad. First quarter trade deficit is doubled compared with what it was a year ago. And a current account deficit of 30 to 40 billion is estimated versus 15 billion in 2021. The export growth isn't going to get any better, especially if EU growth slows. And now they're talking about Germany in recession. I don't know what Italy will do once European Central Bank starts raising interest rates. So Europe is not going to look very good, and export growth to Europe will suffer, while import bill rises because of the energy bill. Meanwhile, the economy is running on credit growth. Credit growth was 46% the 1st of April, year on year. And we have the strange situation where inflation is 64%. Interest rates on these commercial loans are only 20%. Central bank policy rate is only 14%. And so Turkey has the highest negative real interest rates in the world at the moment, which is the most extraordinary situation. And so the government is just pumping the economy with credit through all sorts of guarantees and things. And it looks unlikely to change course because it's preparing for an election in mid-2023. But most of the macro indicators are deteriorating at the moment, including the budget, fiscal situation. I would say that the longer the Ukraine war lasts, the more difficult it will be for the Turkish economy to bring some kind of stability. And I don't know if some of the positives that have been mentioned in international relations can translate into economic support. I think that's one of the big questions. that maybe, other people can comment on.
Thanks so much, Mina. Okay, John, over to you.
The funny thing about Turkey right now is that it actually stands to be a quite positive source of energy for Europe. This may appear paradoxical, but let me start saying what it is. Right now, officially, you have Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, saying, we must become independent from Russian oil, coal, and gas. We simply cannot rely on a supplier who explicitly threatens us. Now, in practice, we're not quite sure what measures they have in mind, and we're not quite sure what they mean by ending reliance. But it does appear that the EU is seriously thinking of finding some kind of a way to remove 100 billion cubic meters of gas imports this year. That is essentially equivalent to 2/3 of the gas volume it imports from Russia and something like more than 1/4 of its total gas consumption last year. There's no way it's going to achieve 100 BCM, but that may not be the point. The point is we are going to see an absolute massive change in how the EU goes about handling gas. Why is Turkey important? Well, there's a massive focus at the moment on liquefied natural gas on the grounds that it can be shipped from producing areas, notably the United States. The problem is that while liquefied natural gas is flexible, Europe has to compete on the open market with Asia for this gas. The other form of gas that comes into the equation is pipeline gas. Now, nobody right now is going to be building new big gas pipelines. But there is a prospect that maybe 10 or even 12 or a bit more of pipeline gas can reach Turkey. And the point about that is quite simply that if it reaches Turkey, then that is 10 or 12 BCM of LNG that Turkey doesn't need to import. And last year, Turkey imported more than 14 billion cubic meters of LNG. So that's quite a lot that can be diverted to Europe. And since much of it comes from suppliers who also supply other parts of Europe, it's very useful. So where can Turkey get this extra pipeline gas from? First of all, it can essentially get it from Turkmenistan. This may appear peculiar, but there's a practical reason for this. Turkmenistan currently has a swap arrangement with Iran, under which it pumps something like 2 BCM a year, very small amount, into Azerbaijan. There are problems with pipeline capacity, but there's no problem with the source. So probably that can be raised to something like 5 or 6 BCM, which goes to Azerbaijan, and there is spare capacity in the existing pipeline connections to Turkey to push that on to Turkey, either directly in the form of Turkmen molecules or indirectly in the form of Azerbaijani molecules. Then there is also a project that I've been working on, which is that in the middle of the Caspian, there's a Turkmen field, much of which is being flared, the gas output. That could, for the construction of a 78-kilometer pipeline, be shipped to Azerbaijan and again put into the existing system. That would take less than a year to complete, much less if we were to get official approval from the Turkmen authorities immediately. So that can be done quickly. And again, the net result is an improvement in condition for Turkey. And the last one, again, Turkmenistan and Iran. At the moment, the Iran-Turkey pipeline is not carrying anything like its nominal 10 billion cubic meters of gas a year. It may be carrying between 35 and 40%, but it's not been doing anything like its full capacity. Why? We're not quite sure. Possibly because of Iranian shortages. But Turkmen gas can be put into the line. There are the connections there. Indeed, it's one of the great delights of working in the gas field that when the first gas reached Turkey from Iran in December 2001, the chemical analysts at BOTASH burst out laughing because they discovered that the molecules were Turkmen, not Iranian. So it can be done. That is a way in which Turkey can play a positive role. There's another way too. Turkish demand for gas may actually fall this year, because last year was a drought year, very poor rains, low hydropower, so therefore much greater need for gas than had been expected. So there may be a natural falling off. And then of course, there's an economic falling off because of the high price of gas. So all of these things make it quite conceivable that Turkey could play a significant role in alleviating, not solving, gas problems in other European countries. What else about energy is important? First of all, on the oil side, there's not really too much to say, simply because oil is a fungible commodity, and in effect, whatever oil Turkey gets from Russia is in the hands of private companies. And I would think that that will continue as long as the Russians wish to keep Turkey on side, and they have very good reasons to wish to keep Turkey on side. At the same time, Turkey enjoys good relations with Gulf producers and can, as it were, build up its stocks with imports from the Gulf. What else? Coal. Coal is a worry, but it's a worry precisely because it highlights the big energy question that confronts the world as a whole. How do you deal with a global energy crisis, which really is desperate to see an end to the mass consumption of fossil fuels, at the same time as you face an immediate crisis, which actually demands stepping up of some fossil fuels in specific markets, notably the European Union? There is no answer to that, except to point out that I live in Scotland, which is reckoned to have the best wind potential in Europe, followed by Turkey. You're going to have to expect more wind farms, more use of solar power, and the quicker that Turkey can do that, the better.
Thank you, Don, very much indeed. Very stimulating. I'm sure that you'll have questions later. Now it's over to Sinan.
Thank you for the invitation, David. Good to see you, many of my friends, Ziya, John, Mina. Let me perhaps follow up on Ziya's remarks on Turkey's stance in this war, because in a way it's quite unique. It's unique in the sense that Turkey is the only NATO country that has not imposed sanctions on Russia. It's unique in the way that even before the war and during the war, Turkey continued to supply armed drones to Ukraine. It's unique because Turkey triggered, as David, you've mentioned, the Montreux Convention and closed the Bosphorus, the Turkish Straits, to the passage of Russian warships. It's also unique because on the basis of this policy, Turkey was the country that acted most effectively among all the other perhaps pretenders, in terms of creating an environment that would facilitate direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. Now, these talks did not lead somewhere, somewhere very positive, but nonetheless, both the foreign ministers, Lavrov and his counterpart, met in Antalya, and 2 weeks after that, the delegations, Ukrainian and Russian delegations, met in Istanbul. So for all of that, for all of those reasons, Turkey has a very unique role, and rather this is a byproduct, if you want, of Turkey's unique circumstances, because as John has mentioned, there is obviously a degree of dependency on Russia for many European nations on the side of energy. Less so economically speaking. Both of them are the case for Turkey, but in addition to that, and this is Turkey's specificity in this, in addition to that, there is also a degree of dependency on Russia for security affairs. And here I'm particularly referring to Syria, where Turkey is in need of Russia's diplomatic partnership in order to preempt a scenario of humanitarian crisis, new refugee waves, focused on Idlib. This really is being at the center of the Astana process, where Turkey and Russia try to manage a rather, very complex and difficult state of affairs in Syria. So it is really that sort of dependency, which is quite unique among NATO allies, that I think Turkish policymakers have been successful to communicate to their counterparts in the West. And this is the result or the ensuing outcome has been that Turkey was able to carve out this very specific policy of being very critical of Russian behavior, but not imposing sanctions. So, and here I just want to spend a minute on what that means in practice. Because the danger, and I'm sure many people in Ankara are aware of that, is that, Turkey would, if it wants to continue this stance, then there is nonetheless a red line that should not be crossed. And that is that, even though Turkey does not implement sanctions, and Turkey's official policy on sanctions is that Turkey only complies with UN mandated sanctions. Of course, in this case, Russia being a permanent member, that doesn't mean much because the UN will never mandate sanctions on Russia. However, that is Turkey's policy. Now, having said that, Turkey is also keenly aware that it should not, be in a position that would trigger either secondary sanctions, which is not the case until now, but it can happen in the future. But also it should not be seen as a country that helps Russia evade the sanctions. So I think the first question about the sustainability of this, fine balancing act, in particular related to sanctions, is whether Turkey keeps well below or well to one side of this thin red line, which is that Turkey does not implement sanctions, but nonetheless is not perceived to be or does not act as a country that helps Russia evade the sanctions. The second important dimension of this delicate balancing act is if we ever going to witness secondary sanctions. Now, that was the case for Iran, but so far the US has not implemented legislation that would trigger, secondary sanctions. And I think this is, open for debate. But I think there a lot hinges on, not on Turkey really, but on China. It seems to me that if China moves in the direction of helping Russia, then we might indeed end up with a regime of secondary sanctions. And that would, even though they might be, legislated for the purpose of keeping China firmly, in line, it would nonetheless affect Turkey and Turkish interests. So the sustainability of Turkey's current stance, therefore, depends paradoxically, perhaps to some extent on what Ankara does, but possibly even more on what China does. And so far, I think we have been fortunate, perhaps, I don't know for how long, but China has been very careful not to be seen in this light of being, helping Russia. On the contrary, that we've seen a very cautious policy on the side of Chinese policymakers for understandable reasons. The third element of this, whether this policy would be sustainable, is basically what happens, on the ground. If we indeed end up with a, even more tragic scenario, possibly even, Russia crossing some of the red lines in terms of use of WMDs, and I don't even want to talk about low-yield nuclear weapons, then that would, obviously create even a much different environment where Turkey could also be put under pressure for implementing sanctions against Russia. Now, the Ukraine policy of Turkey, perhaps, I have been critical of some Turkish foreign policy decisions in the past, but I think the Ukraine policy has been quite a successful one in terms of how Turkey diplomatically achieved this outcome, how it's able still to retain a degree of outreach both to Kiev and to Moscow. And it created a diplomatic space for itself as a major country that's at the center of the diplomatic negotiations for a peace deal. There, the question mark, of course, is, if right now, if Russia is indeed interested genuinely in a peace deal, it seems that the ongoing negotiations have so far not really advanced very much, because I think both sides are not fully ready to engage in earnest in these type of negotiations for a ceasefire. The Russian offensive is venturing from one tragedy to another. Today, their major naval ship, or yesterday, their major naval ship in the Black Sea was attacked and greatly damaged. None of the military mileposts, important at least, was achieved. And on the Ukrainian side, I think we've all been, I can say on my behalf at least, we've been very positively surprised by the resilience and the success of the Ukrainian defense. So I think on both sides, expectations remain unfulfilled. Ukraine now is possibly more empowered and more emboldened, and they seek to achieve a degree of military success on the ground, going from defensive to offensive. And Russia, on the contrary, even though it has now recalibrated its set of ambitions, military ambitions, is also looking to achieve a degree of success. I think that's crucial for Putin to be able to get to a place where he would have a face-saving, quote-unquote, victory to take home. So this constellation does not bode well for an imminent return to a genuine process of peacemaking. And as long as this, we see the dynamics of war overweighing the dynamics of diplomacy, Turkey's stance, which I repeat has been quite successful compared to its past diplomatic initiatives of recent memory, is going to find itself in even more difficult waters. So maybe, I want to end here, having spent the allocated time and allow for the Q&A. So again, thank you for the invitation.
Thanks very much, Sinan. As I mentioned, Sinan will be leaving first, so questions to him will be useful to start with. I want, if I may, to take advantage of my position as chairman to ask a question, which I think is probably for Sinan and/or Ziya. It's a commonplace, of course, that one byproduct of this crisis is that NATO has been revitalized. The United States' commitment to Europe has been strengthened, reinvigorated. It's like NATO in the good old days. I wonder if you think that will last. In the first place, the outcome, whatever it may be in detailed terms, is going to result in the weakening of Russia. The United States, it seems to me, its priorities now are not in Europe, they are in Asia. You've got AUKUS and various other evidence of focus on the Pacific region. My question is, do you think that this interest in commitment in Europe will be sustained, or do you think that, as I rather feel in due course, the United States concern will revert to Asia and the Far East?
Yeah. I think, David, your point already highlights the underlying strategic perceptions and decisions of NATO member states. Those questions have not disappeared. Like, what threat does Russia pose to US versus question of China? Because for them, China has always been the systematic kind of challenger that they focused on. Again, the French elections, which way will it go, even if Macron wins? What kind of process might come out of that in terms of political orientation? Germany, yes, there's been some, commitment, $100 billion but a lot of it is already designated. There are a lot of questions on German policies. But I think when we think about NATO, we have to break it down to, first of all, as an organization. I think as an organization itself, its military wing especially, there is a lot of good stuff operationally in terms of deployments, learning the lessons, in responding to a lot of the questions that we faced in 2014. But now actually we were quite ready to meet some of these, and from information to cyber warfare to deployments, etc. I think at the strategic level, there's always been a core of, if you like, a coalition of the willing within NATO that has carried on some of these responses and attention. And I think UK's policies on Ukraine, has been, again, quite straightforward and quite, praiseworthy for all the criticisms one can have of the current government. I think on Ukraine, there's been a lot of good. And I think that does set a new direction in Europe, one way or another. We have the question of Sweden and Finland now. Even in Germany, within the current government, you can see the tension between the foreign minister, and they're trying to put a word, a kind of formulation to their foreign policy. Direction in Poland has been quite consistent in wanting to host more NATO forces. We are entering a new era. Is this a new Cold War? I hate that terminology. Are we a bit kind of like new World War III? No, I don't think those, analogies work. But I genuinely think things will not go back to where they were. But in terms of how some of these countries will maneuver out of their current commitments or messages, I think it will be, worth to watch. There's a lot in South Europe that I don't think will change. I think they will still want to find a way out of sanctions and questions on energy dependence. But I think for key countries within NATO, things have moved on, and NATO as an organization definitely has moved on. For Turkey, for all of the fallout President Erdogan had with particular countries in Europe, he's always been cautious about NATO, what they said about NATO, what they said about NATO presence in the country. NATO has more than $10 billion worth of assets in the country. That's a huge NATO investment, actually, from radars to bases and things which Turkey also benefits from. And because it was always clear to Ankara that Russia poses questions for Turkey. It's one thing to want to have good working relationships, but Turkey is also vulnerable to Russian pressure. We saw that in the downing of the Russian jet over Syria. I think in this conversation, in the Ukraine war, even some of the new surveys within Turkey have shown more positive attitudes towards NATO among the public. And I think for policymakers, it is clear that that's why their decision to be really careful with how they reacted to NATO tensions have paid dividends. They're still within the alliance, and I think they will always be. But again, how Turkey will maintain not wanting to bring sanctions to Russians, being kind of host of the oligarchs parking their super yachts in Bodrum and in places, I think that is going to be more and more a kind of sore issue in conversations, even though I think there's a lot of understanding within NATO of Turkey's limits, a lot of sympathy towards what it faces and what it can do, what it cannot do. But I think the good news about that is the positive attitude I think President Erdogan and his policymakers have been signaling on all sorts of portfolios for the last year and a half. It is in Armenia, for example, the rapprochement is hopefully finally around the corner, one hopes. Even positive signals towards US, towards Europe, even towards UAE, towards Saudi Arabia. If you've seen the decision on pretty much shutting down the case of the Saudi journalists who have been murdered in Istanbul and the Saudi consulate, I think the caliber of kind of thinking in Ankara towards the elections is normalizing, easing these. So how it will maintain all of those easing vis-a-vis Russia, that's going to be very tricky. But for NATO, I think it's good news. I think this has
I'm going to interrupt you because of Sinan's imminent departure.
Oh, yes.
Sinan, I don't know whether you've got any comments on that. We've got a lot of other questions. One early one from Bill Hale. Bill wanted to know what you felt about the impact of the crisis on Turkey's relationship with Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Yeah, let me start with that question. Before the crisis, before the war, we had witnessed a rather positive dynamic with the Turkish willingness and reciprocated by Armenia to restart the process of normalization. And also this was backed by Baku, by Azerbaijan, because the context had changed compared to 2008, 2009. The leadership in Baku found itself in a more comfortable position after the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, the victory there, and the justification for Turkey to close the borders had evaporated because the borders were closed down in '93 as a result of the Armenian occupation of the rayons in Karabakh. So that has disappeared. However, I think perhaps the parameter there is Russia, and Russia seemed to have played a non-obstructive role with regard to this normalization. But now it remains to be seen whether that will remain, and I think it's too premature to come to a very early conclusion, because it can go in both directions. On the one hand, you can argue that Russian diplomacy has a lot of engagement in other parts of the world near Ukraine and in Ukraine, so they won't focus that much on the Armenia issue. On the other hand, you can also argue that if Turkey goes in the direction of being much more adversarial towards Russia, then Russia will want to block this through its influence in Yerevan. So I think there is a balancing act there as well. But overall, with regard to Turkish policy and NATO, I think this indeed does herald a change in Turkey's foreign policy posture, away from the years of this. I think what was ultimately a misguided belief that Turkey could carve out its own strategic autonomy in this world, being equidistant to Russia and to its main partners in NATO. Those type of foreign policy the visions have come to an end now, have clashed with the real reality of what Russia is. And I think that is going to have an impact on Turkish foreign policy going forward. So we will indeed see Turkey trying to reassert itself within NATO, build up its relationship with its NATO partners. So we are talking about a new era for Turkish foreign policy, just like we're talking about a new era for European geopolitics. With Russia that has become both a conventional and, God forbid, a nuclear threat for the continent.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if you would answer one more question before you leave. It's from John Golden, who you may know. He was our ambassador to Ankara, but also was our permanent representative in NATO, and therefore well qualified in this area. And his question is this: one can sympathize with Turkey's dilemma, given its dependence on Russia for gas, wheat, tourism, etc. But Turkey is using this dependency to avoid sanctions, keep its airspace open, and leave oligarchs untouched. Its few gestures of solidarity are low cost, mildly condemning Putin's invasion and closing the Bosphorus, and even profitable, brackets holding peace negotiations and selling drones to Ukraine. This approach has been described as strategically defensible but morally questionable. But is it even strategically wise? Succor for Putin increases the risk of further salami tactics against other neighbors whose relatively open societies are Putin's main worry. Is it wise for Turkey, which asked NATO for Article 5 protection after invading Syria in 2020, to part from its allies on an issue that in the long term is crucial for Turkey and for all of us?
I don't think that Turkey can really afford to part ways, morally or strategically with the NATO alliance. I think the role that currently is being espoused by the Turkish leadership has, to some extent, the benign neglect of, the main NATO allies. Otherwise, we would have seen much more pressure on Turkey for compliance with sanctions, and we have not seen that. So I think there is value in having at least one NATO country being able to play this diplomatic role. But that's why I spent, a share of my introductory remarks trying to analyze how sustainable Turkey's current position is. And I've tried to outline some parameters that could indeed imperil the sustainability of this position. I think that when push comes to shove, if we get there, Turkey will firmly align itself with the NATO alliance and will not opt in any way to be seen as backing Russia in this very immoral approach of Moscow and Putin.
Thanks very much indeed, Sinan. Are you now going to leave us?
Yes,
okay.
With my, if you'll excuse me.
Of course. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Okay, so we've got a lot of other questions here. Let me start with this one from Alexander Karapiperit. It is this, and I think it's probably for Ziya now, this unified stance of the West against Putin's revisionist adventures and his will to redraw the borders in Ukraine. Do you think that this will serve as an example for President Erdogan's ambitious and destabilizing unilateral actions in the region?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of obviously assumptions and views in that question, which I can respect. But from Ankara's perspective, I think the risks in the region and the limits of its diplomatic reach and the cluster of countries that have grouped together till very recently as some sort of anti-Turkey bloc led it to take a lot more aggressive posturing vis-a-vis questions of energy in Cyprus, vis-a-vis presence in Syria with every attempts to influence things in Iraq and its operations that are unfolding in that. It's a lot more cautious in the Black Sea, and clearly in the Caucasus, it's got a much more kind of pro-Azerbaijan take over the Karabakh, but seeks to normalize with Armenia. Now that the Ankara is wanting to ease a lot of these tensions, and now that it's restoring relations with UAE, even with Saudi Arabia, and with Armenia and with others, I think we are entering to a much kind of, if you like, calmer period, hopefully, in lead up to famous last words, in lead up to the 2023 election, which might have a domestic polemical kind of twist again. But I think economic cost of a lot of Turkish tensions have been clear. Regional developments have really put Turkey into narrow box and alleyway. And I think Ankara wants to get out of it. And I think from now on, you will see, again, much more calmer messages from Ankara wanting to ease and normalize the tensions. Even over question of Cyprus and energy, again, there are signs that actually there might be now a new momentum towards hopefully a win-win scenario over any possible energy finds around Cyprus. But that, again, depends upon other actors in the region as well as the United States. But I think those tricky periods are hopefully behind us for a while.
Thank you very much, Ziya. I think this one is a question for Mina. It's from George Lemot. What payment channels exist for trade with Russia, given the effects of US, EU, and UK sanctions on transmission in dollars, euros, and sterling?
Yes, I'm not 100% sure, but I mean there is a sort of ruble Turkish lira payment thing going on, and central banks in Russia and Turkey are trying to intervene to try to maintain some sort of stability in the trade, in the exchange rate that is imposed on trade, so that, you know, if an exporter in Turkey agrees to a price in rubles and then rubles collapse 50% by the time it gets there in a week's time, to somehow compensate for that kind of thing. That's okay for, I think, smaller traders, but the bigger ones, I'm just really, I mean, there's hardly any Russian banks left that are not sanctioned. I mean, you know, 3 weeks ago, you still had Sberbank, which wasn't sanctioned, but now it is, and so on. So it's becoming very, very difficult now how they're going to do that. They may well bring in this barter arrangement, which did exist during Özal's time and Soviet Union time, and that's a possibility. But you know, I'm not seeing any other kind of they could sort of, yeah, it's some kind of barter arrangement is the most likely.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. I think the issue of Finland and Sweden joining NATO came up briefly earlier on, and we have a question from Henry Jones Davis. What will Turkey's reaction be to the possible expansion of NATO if Finland and Sweden join, given the inevitable increase of tension? Ziya or John?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment I'm not seeing any strong, maybe I might have missed, I'm not seeing any strong kind of diplomatic reaction either way. I mean, I know there is skepticism towards Sweden and even Finland in some of the tensions prior to bilateral relationship and their reactions. But I think Turkey, again, could really benefit from using this new process, because obviously they need Turkey's approval to join, to ease some of the tensions with Sweden, etc., that they had over the years. Strategically, I think maybe because I'm such a pro-NATO person that I think this is really good news for NATO overall. I think our arguments about why this shouldn't happen doesn't apply really anymore. And a stable Europe and a stronger NATO is not bad news for Turkey. And particularly if that kind of contains some of the future possible Russian adventures on very close to Turkey's interest, then actually this is good news for Turkey. But I would imagine they would seek to get bilateral compromises and kind of conversations with particularly Sweden in this process.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thank you very much. I've got one more question, which again, please, whoever would like to answer from, which is this from Firdevs Robinson, who I'm sure many of you know. Are you surprised to see just a strong skepticism towards Ukraine and the hostility towards NATO and the US, especially coming from the left and from the critics of the government in Turkey? Ziya, would you like to try that one?
Yeah, yeah, happy to. Look, I think Turkish left has been critical of NATO and US intrinsically, so they've never been really pro that. Again, there's been a lot of pro-Russian views in Turkish left and on Turkish Islamic kind of right. And then a particular brand of left as well that blends in some of the nationalist themes, even particular blends of right, have always had a more positive tilt towards Russia vis-a-vis reaction towards the United States. But again, those have not necessarily shaped how the policymakers or defense or security structures in Ankara saw themselves and responded to themselves. So I'm actually not surprised at all that you saw a broad spectrum of people in the country, left, right, liberal, very liberal people, almost defending Russia. And again, talking about, United States as even the bad guy, or why did NATO did this and NATO expansion. And it's really sad. And if you have the heart, energy and the power towards some of these Turkish TV programs that every night for hours and hours, it's very depressing, and how some of these issues are perceived, understood and responded to. And I think that's not surprising to me at all. What is surprising is how Ankara thus far maintained, a very cautious and careful tightrope walk amidst political pressure domestically, perhaps to take a particular view, even among their own voters. But I think as the time goes on, some of the recent surveys this week has shown a drop in popularity towards Russia, and questions about Russia as a threat to Turkey has increased. And I think as time goes on, hopefully public will catch up with the reality of what is happening on Turkey's borders.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a sort of follow-up really from Celia Karzik. She says, so has the crisis level strengthened Erdogan's position given these attitudes in Turkish public opinion?
Mina might be, Mina and Can, please feel free to jump in too. I think the main challenge for Erdogan is the economy and the living expenses of people. So foreign policy might very well play and kind of an impulse in a chart if the government takes a bold stance for Turkey. But this is not a direct issue for Turkey. I think as much as this debate is unfolding, I think for Turks, it's economy. The living costs, their day-to-day experiences, and identity blocks in Turkey that have shaped voting patterns in a really tangible sense. So I can't see any data as of yet that shows a positive correlation or an increase for Erdogan's vote ratings or his party. But I've seen enough data for the last 2-3 months to show genuine questions, even among their own voters, about the management of the country. Is this actually going well? Look at the reality of the economy and everything that is happening. And so I think that explains why Erdogan is very cautious, and why a lot of these easing and normalizing conversations are happening, and why some of these balancing acts are coming in. But I think for voters, it's going to boil down to, again, it's a cliche, but economy, I think more than ever, it's going to be the Achilles heel, if you like, and people's main reason if they vote either way.
Mina, any more comment on that point?
Well, I would just like to perhaps ask Ziya. I agree with the point he made that I think it's the economy that is the biggest problem in people's minds. But I sort of ask myself, why is Erdogan mending fence with everyone else? Why is he trying to do all this? And this is where the whole question of, how much financial support could he get, A, from the West, and B, from the Gulf. And I'm just wondering if, this is what it's all about. The government is very aware of just what a tightrope that they're on in terms of the economy, and how are they going to end this year and head into an election by mid next year. With oil prices where they are and where inflation where it is, how are they going to fund $200 billion of external financing requirement? There could be a sort of rollover risk. I mean, debt gets rolled over, and that's how it's been funded so far. But what if there's a rollover risk? And they don't want to mess up they don't want to create any external political crises to ensure they don't have that kind of external attack on the lira or the debt repayments, etc. So I think that this sort of all of a sudden getting on with everyone has very much also economic side to it.
Very much. I've got a question from Stephen Mitchell about refugees. Of course, there are a great many refugees in Turkey coming from a different direction. But he wonders about the numbers of Ukrainians and what impact this is having on Turks. Would anyone like to try that one?
I think at this stage, I haven't seen a major kind of number or a discussion. I think for most Ukrainians, the movements have been towards the West. So I don't think Turkey has received as many unless they were there. But obviously, the public has been quite wary of the Syrian population and then others in the country. So that refugee question is a big one politically in Turkey. So I can't imagine if there was a larger number of people from Ukraine, even if they were Crimean Turks, I think eventually it will be very difficult for Erdogan government to host another larger wave of refugees without facing a political backlash. It has been able to contain the backlash on Syria. I mean, if any other country has taken 5 million refugees as Turkey has for the last 10 years, the government would have fallen. But the AKP government has managed that public side of it quite effectively and quietened some of the conversations, and its supporters stuck with it. But I think any more refugees would be a huge political question for them.
Thanks very much. I've got an awful lot more questions, but I think we must draw this session to a close. I'd like to ask the other panelists, whether they've got any concluding remarks they'd like to make. I think perhaps in particular John, whose presentation was of extreme importance and very interesting, but we haven't heard from him since. Right.
The first thing is that the economic issues facing Turkey will not go away. In fact, they will intensify because of the crisis. And it's always possible that deft handling, which we have seen from the Turkish government of the crisis, will go some way towards giving it a boost, but that'll be temporary. And we've got another year to run before the election or so. And that's going to be a year of very tough times made worse by the crisis. So I don't really see any silver lining for the Erdogan government in that. In the longer run, there was a point about Finland and Sweden joining NATO. That may, of course, have severe implications for the Turkish defense industry, because these are two very effective military producers. So Turkey will actually need to develop effective partnerships with them in order to boost its own defense industry and its own exports elsewhere in the world. The last thing is on energy itself. There was a brief mention of the East Med. One would like to think that bringing the NATO powers together in a crisis makes them realize it's better to work together. But that means everybody having to eat an awful lot of humble pie in order to resolve the Cyprus crisis, problem, whatever you call it. And if that is not on the way to some kind of resolution, then it is not possible to envisage, for instance, Eastern Mediterranean oil and gas reaching Turkey, even though Turkey is the logical commercial market. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, John. Mina, anything final to say?
No, I mean, I think my last comment was kind of my final comment. Thank you.
Ziya.
No, thank you. I spoke a lot already.
No, come on. Okay. Well, thank you all very much indeed. I enjoyed your contributions enormously, and I'm sure all the other participants have. It's been a really great morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.